Mason stands beneath the blood-stained cottonwood, Boone's still form limp in the dirt, and he finds the note, "You're next," read in the morning light. Mason Delaney rose before the sun, as he always did. The frost hadn't yet lifted from the brittle grass outside, and the sky hung low with the pale promise of heat to come. He moved slow but steady, bones stiff from years of labor and the weight of quieter regrets. The porch boards creaked under his boots as he stepped out, coffee steaming in his tin cup. He scanned the horizon like a man watching for ghosts, though none had come in years. The ranch sat quiet in its corner of nowhere, half a day's ride east of Dust Creek, and ringed by cottonwoods and chaparral. No wife, no children, just Boone, 10 years old and half-wolf by look and heart, who padded alongside him like a shadow with teeth. They understood each other, man and dog, having come through blood and fire together. Boone had saved Mason's life once in a way that went beyond teeth and muscle. It was the kind of bond that made you forget for a while what you'd done. The cabin was lean and solid, built with his own hands after he walked away from everything else, after the fire at Widow's Gulch, after the guns. It had taken time to live quiet, even longer to sleep without reaching for iron at every creak of wood or howl in the dark. Mason earned peace the way a man earns his scars, slowly, painfully, without guarantee. That morning, the wind carried something strange, a stillness too thick for dawn. Birds stayed silent. Even the coyotes had kept their distance overnight. Boone stiffened beside him on the porch, ears pricked, muzzle lifted. Then he growled low, a sound Mason hadn't heard in years. Mason stepped off the porch, heart already sinking. His boots cut a path through frost as he followed Boone's stare toward the cottonwood at the edge of the yard, the oldest one, with roots like clawed fingers gripping the earth. And there he stopped. The tin cup fell from his hand and landed silently in the dirt. Boone hung from a branch like a man. Rope taut, legs slack, neck bent wrong. His body swayed gently in the morning breeze. Mason staggered forward, disbelief clashing with horror, until his hand found bark. His breath came shallow. Pinned to the trunk, just above Boone's lifeless body, was a strip of canvas paper, the letters jagged and red like they'd been scratched in blood. "You're next." Mason didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just stared, shoulders trembling as he reached up and cut Boone down with his hunting knife. The body hit the earth with a thud too heavy for words. He knelt there, cradling the only thing left that still made him human, and let the cold seep into his bones. The cottonwood's bark scraped Mason's knuckles as he slammed a fist against it. Splinters bit into his skin, but the pain didn't matter. Boone's body lay at his feet, limbs askew in the dirt, fur matted where the rope had bit deep. Mason knelt beside him, hands trembling as he brushed frost from the grizzled snout, half expecting breath to rise. It didn't. The air around him stayed cold, still, hollowed out. He lifted the crude canvas note again. Red ink, but it smelled like something else, coppery and sharp. He folded it once, then again, and tucked it into his coat pocket like a wound too fresh to look at. A message like that wasn't just a warning. It was personal. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to hurt him. They wanted to unmake him, slowly, intimately. Mason gathered Boone's body with care, cradling the weight like an old friend. He dug the grave himself in the frozen morning soil, shovels striking roots and rocks with dull resistance. His breath steamed in the air as he worked, coat open, sweat freezing to his shirt. The ground didn't give easy, and that felt right somehow. It was supposed to hurt. He laid Boone down in the earth just after noon, wrapped in Mason's own saddle blanket. He didn't speak over the grave. No words felt worthy. just a long silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through dry cottonwood branches. Then he covered the hole, one scoop at a time, until the mound stood level with the land. By dusk, he sat on the porch again, shotgun across his lap, eyes on the tree line. The note still burned in his coat like a brand. He thought of the men he'd killed, the towns he'd fled, and the names he never spoke aloud anymore. Anyone who knew how to send a message like that had known him before the quiet years, before the ranch, before the guilt settled into something that felt like peace. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, but Mason stayed outside, unmoving. He didn't blink when a coyote called out from far off or when a bird startled from a nearby branch. He watched the dark gather itself between the trees and waited. Whatever this was, it had already begun. By morning, the stillness had grown teeth, the kind of quiet that didn't come from nature, but from something watching. Mason moved through his routine with mechanical precision, feeding the horses, checking the barn, splitting wood, but his eyes never stopped scanning. He noticed the little things first. The gate to the corral hung open, even though he had latched it tight the night before. One of the water barrels had been tipped, soaking the ground and leaving the horses thirsty and restless. A length of rope had vanished from the wall hook inside the tack shed. Then he found the stirrups. They were tied together and looped over a fence post at the north edge of the pasture, swinging gently in the breeze like some crude ornament. No prints around them, just the leather, worn and cracked, swaying in a slow rhythm that felt mocking. Mason stared for a long time, then reached out and untied them with steady hands. Someone had been close enough to walk the property, to enter the barn, to leave a sign that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't far from it either. He looped the stirrups back over his saddle and rode the fence line twice, rifle across his lap, eyes narrowed. He found nothing. No broken brush, no boot prints, no tracks leading in or out. Whoever it was knew how to disappear. He didn't sleep that night. The fire in the hearth burned low, shadows moving across the walls of the cabin. Mason sat in the chair by the window, shotgun resting against his knee, every sense strung tight. Once, just before midnight, he heard a creak on the porch. Not wind, wood shifting under weight. He rose quietly, stepping to the door with practiced silence. But when he pulled it open, there was nothing there. No prints in the frost. Just the scent of pine and the deep hush of the trees. He didn't go back to sleep. In the morning, he found Boone's collar placed neatly on the front steps, cleaned, polished, set like an offering or a message. Mason crouched beside it, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Whoever this was, they weren't just hunting him. They were playing with him. The road into Dust Creek hadn't seen Mason's boots in over a year, but he rode it now, with his coat buttoned high and his rifle slung across his saddle like old times. The town looked the same, lean buildings pressed against a backdrop of low hills, smoke rising from chimneys, and townsfolk moving about their routines with the wary eyes of people who had long since stopped expecting justice. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, nodding at the clerk behind the counter. The man froze mid-count, gaze dropping to the rifle. Mason didn't bother with pleasantries. "Anyone been asking about me?" The clerk hesitated, then shook his head, though his hands twitched like someone holding back a truth. Mason leaned on the counter, voice low. "You sure about that?" The clerk looked down, then mumbled, "Stranger passed through a few days back. Didn't give a name. Didn't buy much. Just asked if the man who lived out past the cottonwoods was still breathing." Mason didn't speak. He just nodded once, slow and grim, then walked out. The saloon was next. He didn't drink anymore, but he knew stories moved through liquor faster than mail. Inside, it smelled like sweat, stale tobacco, and yesterday's decisions. A piano plinked softly in the corner, played by a girl with empty eyes. Mason scanned the room. One of the card players near the back stiffened when their eyes met. Mason knew that face. Elijah Cutter, former enforcer for the Gallows Bend gang, thought hanged 5 years ago in New Mexico. But there he was, fingers trembling over his cards. Mason approached slow, boots thudding against worn floorboards. Cutter looked up, face pale. "Mason," he said, voice dry as sand. "Didn't think you were still around." Mason didn't sit. "Someone left Boone swinging from my cottonwood. Left me a note. Red ink. Said I was next." Cutter swallowed. "Wasn't me." Mason believed him. Cutter had always been a coward, not the kind to toy before killing. But Cutter knew something. That much was clear in the way his hands fidgeted, how he avoided looking Mason in the eye. "You ever hear from the others?" Mason asked. "From the Gulch?" Cutter shook his head, but his lips tightened. Mason waited. Silence stretched until Cutter exhaled. "Jeb Marsh didn't die in that fire like we thought. He got out. Burned bad, but alive. Word was he drifted south into the Badlands. Went quiet after that." Mason nodded again, slower this time. He turned without another word and walked out, the name heavy in his chest. Jeb Marsh, the kid who never should have made it through that night. A face Mason had last seen behind the smoke, eyes wide with betrayal and flame. If Jeb was alive, if he'd spent years nursing that wound, then Boone's death was only the beginning. The air shifted in the days that followed, charged with something that made the skin crawl. Mason's routines sharpened into rituals. He cleaned his rifles twice a day, set tripwires around the property using old trapper's tricks, and slept in short, shallow stretches with his hand always near steel. The fire inside the cabin never died. He kept it going not for warmth but for light, to see what might come crawling in from the dark. Each morning brought some new disturbance. The food stores he'd packed in salt barrels were spoiled, meat blackened and crawling with flies, though the lids had never been touched. His saddle had been cut clean through at the girth, the leather sliced with a knife, not torn. He found fresh tracks by the creek one evening, too small for elk, too quiet for deer, too purposeful for anything but human. But it wasn't just sabotage. It was theater. One morning he discovered Boone's favorite antler toy placed on the porch, cleaned and set dead center like an altar offering. Mason didn't pick it up. He stared at it for a long while, jaw clenched, eyes dry. Then he walked back inside and began reinforcing the windows with timber and iron nails. The dog was gone, but whoever had taken him was making damn sure Mason never forgot. He considered riding out, putting distance between himself and whatever shadow now circled his land, but instinct held him in place. This was personal. He'd left a trail of ghosts behind him across 2 territories. But this wasn't some bounty or vendetta come calling for gold. This was slower, colder. Someone who knew the details of his life, the layout of his home, the name of his dog. He thought of Jeb Marsh again, tried to summon the boy's face from memory. Freckles, twitchy hands, that damn nervous smile. The last time Mason had seen him was through smoke and screaming. As he ran through Widow's Gulch with fire curling across rooftops. He remembered turning away, choosing not to finish what the flames had started. That night, Mason sat by the hearth with his Winchester across his knees and the cabin sealed tight. The wind shifted around midnight, carrying a faint rustle of movement, branches cracking, something stepping carefully across the edge of the woods. He didn't rise. He just waited, breathing slow, knowing that whoever was out there had no intention of striking yet. Not tonight. Not until the fear had rooted itself so deep inside him that pulling it loose would tear everything else apart. The trail curved south through brittle hills and vanished into the burned scar that was once Widow's Gulch. Mason hadn't ridden this way in 7 years. Not since the fire. Not since the blood. The land remembered, even if the world had moved on. Charred posts still jutted from the earth like crooked teeth. Blackened stone marked where the church once stood, its bell melted into a twisted, rusted shell in the dirt. The saloon had collapsed into itself, but Mason could still see the outline of the barroom door where he'd once stood with a pistol in each hand and the screams of dying men echoing off the rafters. He dismounted slowly and walked through the ash. The wind stirred up fine gray powder that clung to his boots and cuffs, coating his skin with memory. It smelled of old smoke, dry wood, and something deeper, something human. He found the well near the center of town, half filled with rubble, and crouched beside it. In the dirt nearby lay the curled remains of a belt buckle, its silver scorched but still visible. The initials were almost gone, but Mason didn't need them to know it had belonged to Avery Rusk, one of the old crew, a man who didn't make it out. He stood there a long while, letting the silence press in. This was the graveyard he'd helped build, even if it never had markers. Every step in this place felt like an echo of choices made, paths not taken, and people left behind. He could see Boone running through the smoke, herding stragglers, barking over the din. He could see Jeb, a kid too green for the things they asked of him, stumbling out of the general store with a burn across his cheek and terror in his eyes. Mason remembered the moment he could have turned back, could have dragged Jeb out by the collar, could have spared him whatever pain had shaped him since. But instead, he'd kept walking, told himself it was too late, that the fire would handle what he couldn't, that mercy back then was a weakness he couldn't afford. By the time he returned to his horse, the sun had dipped behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long across the land. He mounted without a word and turned back toward home, wind tugging at his coat, ash settling on his shoulders like old judgment. Something had shifted out here. He could feel it in the way the sky darkened too quick, in the taste of dust on his tongue. Whatever came next wouldn't wait much longer. The past wasn't buried. It had been waiting, watching, and now it had followed him home. The cabin was dark when Mason returned, but something in the air told him it wasn't empty. The door stood ajar, not broken but left open, as if inviting him to cross a threshold he wouldn't return from. He dismounted quietly, rifle in hand, boots sinking into the soft dirt. The wind had died completely. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Inside, the fire had burned low. A thin line of smoke curled toward the rafters. Mason stepped in slow, eyes scanning the room. Nothing was taken, but everything had been touched. His rifle rack was open, the box of .44 cartridges overturned. On the mantel above the hearth sat something new. An old board, warped at the edges, pinned with a hand-drawn map. He stepped closer. The map was charcoal on burlap, its lines rough but deliberate. At the center was a sketch of the old gulch, marked with crosses and names, each one burned in deeper than the rest. Avery Rusk, Silas Griggs, Boone. Mason felt his throat tighten. Off to one side was a single word scratched so hard into the fabric it had frayed the thread beneath. Justice. He touched the edge of the map with a calloused finger, then pulled it from the mantel. The ashes beneath shifted, revealing something else. A child's toy, wooden, hand-carved, shaped like a horse, the tail scorched black. Mason recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Jeb. He'd carved it one winter when the snows trapped them inside for 3 weeks, his hands raw from cold but still whittling away at scraps just to keep busy. Mason had laughed when the leg snapped, had told the boy he was wasting time. Now, standing in his own home with that broken horse at his feet, the memory cut deeper than any blade. He didn't sit, didn't rest. He began moving through the cabin, checking every corner, every latch, every piece of gear. He found boot prints by the back door, small, deliberate, leading out toward the woods. He followed them to the edge of the tree line, but no farther. Whoever had come this close wanted him to know it. They had walked right through the middle of his life and left behind breadcrumbs soaked in guilt and fire. Back inside, Mason hung his rifle beside the door and poured water into a basin to wash his hands. The blood wasn't literal, but it clung to him all the same. He didn't bother wiping the water away, just stood at the basin, staring at his reflection in the darkened glass, and whispered to the room, "You should have died that night, Jeb." The cabin answered with silence, and outside the woods waited for morning. The moon hung low and yellow, casting long, bent shadows across the pasture as Mason sat by the window, Winchester resting across his lap. The night didn't hum with insects like it should have. It didn't carry the usual coyote cries or owl calls. It felt held in suspension, like even the creatures knew something unnatural had taken root on this land. Boone's collar sat on the mantel, polished to a dull shine, catching firelight now and again, like an ember trying not to die. Mason's eyes kept drifting to it, then back to the tree line. He hadn't spoken aloud in 2 days, not since Dust Creek. Not since Cutter whispered that name like it carried weight even the grave couldn't bury. Jeb Marsh, a boy who'd trusted too easily, laughed too loud, and never learned how deep a man's silence could go. A creak on the porch snapped Mason upright. Not the wind, not wood settling. The kind of sound made by boot leather shifting slow on old boards. He didn't move right away, just listened. Another step followed, deliberate and soft. Then nothing. He rose carefully, knees stiff, weapon in hand. The cabin's floor didn't groan as he crossed it. He knew where to step. He reached the door and paused, breath low, then yanked it open and raised the barrel. The porch was empty. But at the edge of the yard, just beyond the fence where the cottonwoods grew thickest, a figure stood. Tall, still, half-shadowed in moonlight. Mason couldn't see the face, only the shape, the tilt of the head, the way the shoulders hung loose, confident, like someone who had already imagined every possible end to this night and had made peace with all of them. Mason didn't lower his rifle. "You come here to finish it?" he asked, voice dry. The figure didn't answer, just stood there, watching. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed straight toward Boone's grave. Mason felt something turn in his gut, slow and cold. He didn't speak again, didn't fire. The figure didn't move closer, didn't run. After a long moment, it stepped back into the trees and vanished like smoke into the dark. He stood there for a while, rifle still raised, as the wind picked up and the silence broke apart like shattered glass. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the land exhaled. And Mason knew the time for questions had passed. The reckoning was no longer waiting in the wings. It was here, and it had eyes. The following evening brought no stars. Thick clouds moved in low, pressing the sky shut and swallowing the last of the light. Mason didn't bother lighting a lamp. He sat in the dark with his back against the cabin wall, rifle balanced across his thighs and a pistol strapped tight to his leg. Every door was locked, every window reinforced, every breath measured. It started just past midnight. A single crack echoed across the yard, wood snapping under force. Mason rose instantly, heart steady, footsteps soundless as he moved to the front window. Another crack followed, closer this time. He eased open the shutter and peered out. Movement near the barn. Something tall, fast. Then came the fire. A bottle arced through the air and shattered against the porch steps. Flames spilled across the wood, licking up the side of the house. Mason moved without hesitation, grabbed the water barrel, and doused it before the blaze could take hold. He didn't shout, didn't curse, just stepped back inside, grabbed the Winchester, and opened the front door. The yard lay half lit by burning embers. Smoke curled through the dry air. From the shadows near the corral, a figure stepped forward. The same build as before, same confident walk. But this time, the man carried a rifle of his own. Mason raised his weapon, but he didn't fire. The stranger stopped just short of the porch steps. "You left me in the flames," he said, voice raw, cracked like old wood. Mason didn't answer. He didn't have to. The rifle barked, a flash of light tearing through the dark. Mason dropped low, rolled behind the porch post, returned fire. The figure staggered but didn't fall. Another shot, this one grazing the corner of the cabin wall. Mason moved fast, circled wide, flanked the attacker through the smoke. He fired again. This time the figure dropped to one knee, clutching his side. Mason closed the distance, rifle raised, heart pounding. The face that turned toward him was smeared with ash and blood, but unmistakable. Jeb Marsh, eyes wild, burn scars like melted wax down his neck, hands shaking but still gripping the rifle. "You should have finished it," Jeb rasped, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. "Back then, when you had the chance." Mason didn't speak. He stared at the boy who was no longer a boy, the man shaped by flame and betrayal. Jeb tried to raise the weapon again. Mason stepped forward and kicked it from his grasp. It landed hard in the dirt. Jeb looked up, breathing ragged. "Go on, then," he said, voice breaking. "Do it right this time." But Mason didn't move. The gun stayed in his hand, steady. The night waited. The fire behind him still crackled low, casting long shadows across the wounded man in the dust. And in Mason's silence, something colder than revenge began to settle into the bones of the land. Jeb's breath came in sharp, uneven pulls, each one laced with pain. Blood soaked through the fabric at his ribs, dark and thick, but his eyes never left Mason's. They burned with something deeper than hatred. It was grief, layered under years of silence, and sharpened into something lethal. "You left me there," Jeb said again, quieter this time, like the fire had finally taken the edge off his anger. "In the church. I screamed for you. You turned away." Mason didn't argue. The memories had never faded. He could still see the boy clawing at the door, smoke curling up the walls. Could still hear the roar of flames as he told himself there was no time, no chance. He had Boone at his heels and a bullet in his leg. He told himself Jeb would never have made it out, but he hadn't even tried. "I waited," Jeb went on, voice trembling. "Waited through the pain, through the healing, through all the years nobody looked for me. You all thought I was dead, buried with the rest of the town. But I wasn't. I dug my way out." Mason said nothing, but his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. "They took me in down south," Jeb continued. "A family, good people. I was 16 and half dead. They gave me a place to heal. But I couldn't forget. Not when I looked in the mirror and saw what the fire left behind. Not when I couldn't sleep without seeing you walk away." Mason lowered the rifle slowly, not because the danger had passed, but because it felt pointless now. This wasn't a standoff. This was a reckoning. "You think I wanted this?" Jeb spat. "The games, the fear. I didn't come to kill you. Not at first. I came because I needed to see if you even remembered. If Boone was just a dog to you, or if he meant what I thought he did. But you didn't come looking. You just waited." Mason's voice finally broke through, rough and tired. "I remembered every day." Jeb looked at him for a long time, as if searching for a lie. Whatever he found must have settled something, because he didn't answer. His body sagged a little, strength draining fast. The anger was still there, but it had lost its center. Now there was only pain. "I didn't want to die alone in the dark again," Jeb said, barely above a whisper. "Not like last time." Mason stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He knelt beside the broken man he had once called brother-in-arms. He pressed a hand to Jeb's wound, firm but careful, then took off his coat and wrapped it tight. "You won't," Mason said, voice steady. And for the first time in years, the night let out a breath. The dawn came slow, bleeding across the hills like a wound trying to close. Mason stayed crouched beside Jeb through the long hours of night, his coat pressed to the wound, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of return. But nothing came. No more fire. No more footsteps. Just the wind, cold and quiet, brushing through the cottonwoods like an old lullaby. Jeb drifted in and out of consciousness. When he spoke, it was mostly nonsense. Half-formed memories, muttered names from the past, questions that never waited for answers. Mason didn't respond to most of it. He just kept the pressure steady and watched the sky lighten. By full morning, Jeb stirred enough to drink from the canteen. His hand shook so badly, Mason had to steady it for him. Neither man spoke for a while. The silence wasn't empty. It carried the weight of everything that had passed between them, all the years and ashes and bullets that never found their mark. Mason finally stood, knees stiff, and walked a slow circle around the yard. He gathered the scattered gear, kicked dirt over the last of the embers near the porch, and checked the barn for damage. The horses were spooked but unharmed. The traps he'd set along the north ridge remained untouched. It was over. At least for now. When he came back to Jeb, the younger man had managed to sit up against a fence post, pale but alert. His voice came rough, almost reluctant. "You could have left me." Mason didn't look at him when he answered. "I did once. Not again." Jeb nodded, a slow, tired motion, more acceptance than agreement. "I don't know what happens next." "Neither do I," Mason said quietly. "But you're going to live long enough to figure it out." They didn't say goodbye. Mason hoisted Jeb onto his horse, tying him in tight so he wouldn't fall. He'd ride him into Dust Creek, leave him with the doctor, let the law decide what came after. Maybe nothing. Maybe years behind bars. But that part wasn't Mason's to carry anymore. He paused one last time by the cottonwood, eyes drawn to the disturbed soil at its base. Boone's grave remained untouched, save for a few leaves blown down in the night. Mason reached into his coat and pulled out the charred wooden horse Jeb had once carved. He placed it gently on the grave next to Boone's collar and stepped back without a word. There would be no justice for Widow's Gulch, no absolution. Only this: two men broken by the same fire, neither of them whole, neither of them dead. One still bleeding, one still standing, and between them the ghost of a dog who had kept watch long after the rest of the world stopped looking. Dust Creek stirred early, though most folks kept their eyes down as Mason rode in. The sight of him, blood on his sleeves, face hollowed by fatigue, leading a second horse with a wounded man tied to the saddle, was enough to silence the usual whispers. The town had long memories, and Mason Delaney had always walked its edge like a shadow no one wanted to name. He brought Jeb to the doctor's door without fanfare, knocked once, then waited as the old man appeared in his nightshirt, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Mason said only, "He needs tending. Got a bullet in him, deep." The doctor nodded, stepping aside to let the past bleed into the present. Mason didn't follow them inside. Instead, he rode north, back through the thinning trees and along the ridgeline that overlooked his land. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, faint but familiar. From up here, the cabin looked smaller, just another scar against the wilderness. He dismounted, walked to the edge, and sat with his back to a boulder, warmed by the morning sun. There was no relief, no sudden peace, just the ache in his chest and the absence beside him, the place Boone should have been. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded canvas scrap, the one with the red ink still visible across the creases. He didn't read it again, just stared at it for a moment, then let the wind take it, watching it flutter and vanish into the trees below. He didn't know what he'd do next. The land was still his. The cabin still stood. But something essential had shifted, like the final plank removed from an old bridge. The silence he'd built his life around had been broken, and in its place was a kind of reckoning that had no end. Maybe he'd rebuild. Maybe he'd write again, this time not to flee the past, but to meet whatever future the land had left for a man like him. The sun rose higher, and he stood, dusted off his coat, and walked slowly back toward the path. Behind him the cottonwood swayed. Below, Boone's grave remained untouched, the wooden horse and collar catching the light. And as Mason passed beneath the trees, the breeze lifted for just a moment, carrying with it the faintest sound, something between a bark and the rustle of leaves. He didn't turn to look. He just kept walking, one step at a time, into the day the land had waited to give him. Months passed, and the seasons turned with their usual indifference. Snow came late that winter, clinging to the edges of the cottonwoods and softening the scars left behind. The cabin stood steady, smoke curling from its chimney some mornings, silent others. The land did what land always does. It remembered without speaking. In Dust Creek, folks still whispered about the night fire danced on the horizon and gunshots cracked like dry wood in the hills. Some said Delaney had finally snapped, that he'd been waiting for blood since the day he rode out of Widow's Gulch with nothing but a dog and a haunted stare. Others claimed the man he brought in, broken and burned, confessed to every evil done in that old town. No one knew for sure, and Mason never came down to answer their questions. Jeb Marsh recovered slow. The doctor said the bullet missed anything vital by inches, but that the real wounds were older, deeper, and unlikely to heal clean. He never asked for mercy, never offered apology. But when the sheriff came calling, Jeb didn't run. He walked out on his own, face covered and eyes forward, and climbed into the wagon like a man who'd already lived his sentence long before chains ever found him. Mason watched him go from the edge of town, then turned back toward the hills. He had no more business there. Spring brought new grass and the start of a small garden near the porch. The corral gate hung straight again. The well bucket was replaced. He patched the roof with fresh cedar. Some days he spoke aloud to Boone, low and quiet, about the weather or the hawk nesting by the creek. Just a voice in the stillness, steady and plain, as though he believed the dog might still be listening. He never carried the note again, never redrew the map or spoke the names of the men who died in the Gulch. But every now and then, when the fire burned low and the coyotes sang from the far ridge, he'd sit on the porch and trace the scars on his hands with the edge of a cup, remembering the heat, the smoke, and the sound of boots walking away from flame. The land didn't ask him to forget, only to endure. And Mason Delaney did, in the quiet way of men who've already made peace with the price of being spared. He lived not because he sought redemption, but because the story wasn't finished, not yet. Somewhere out there, the hills still carried the echoes. And each morning he rose, one more shadow taller than yesterday, and walked into whatever truth the day offered. Not forgiven, not free, but still standing,